nonetheless, let's do a timeline review. So where I'd start, of course, is the Renaissance. Renaissance 1400 to about 1600. Now, there's two aspects to the Renaissance. The Divining Light is not 1500, but if you think of it about there, that's not wrong. You know, the Sistine Chapel, David, that's all in the early 1500s, so you're close. First part of the Renaissance, sometimes it's called early, sometimes it's called the Italian Renaissance. And we know the characteristics of the Italian Renaissance. The big one is humanism. Patronage. Guys, don't forget about patronage. Patronage is not only a good term that they like to put on the test a lot, but also that pops up quite frequently. That pops up quite frequently. It's also a great synthesis. Anytime somebody who's rich or the government supports anything, you can call it patronage and synthesize there. I would also put secularism, which is one of my clusters for this whole first half of the year. Secularism. I really can't stress enough that I think that's what the whole first half of European history is about. And then finally, Machiavelli. All right, that's a lot, but that's a lot of points that we're going to make for the Renaissance. But I think those are all fair and needed. Then the Northern Renaissance or the Late Renaissance. All you need to write down is Christian humanism. Okay, all you need to write down is Christian humanism. By the way, I'm going to go real fast today. You might not get to write everything down. Here is my final copy. I will have, unless I get caught up first bell, I will have one of these for you in class. Okay, and all these are even less than the key concepts, but hopefully they make sense. The next era we talk about is the Reformation. You know the actual date at the start of the Reformation. That's 1517. 1517 with a 95 thesis. I usually put the Reformation just in the 1500s. End it at 1600. Okay? Now, there's two parts to the Reformation that you need to know. First up is the Protestant Rev. The Protestant Rev. There's a whole lot that goes on in here. It's actually a pretty big section. But if you had to sum up everything for the Protestant Reformation, what I would say is that one long word, anti-clericalism. Anti-clericalism. All right? You remember what that word means? Anti-clergy, okay? So what bullet points, if we were doing a full-time on, would we put under anti-clericalism? Simony, right? Which is what selling offices. Nepotism, which is giving offices to your friends. Pluralism, taking multiple jobs. Absenteeism, indulgences. All that would fall under anti-clericalism. That is Martin Luther's biggest push, to end the abuses of the feudal political Roman Catholic Church and everything that goes along with it. It's all about the one invention we have on this list on its own, and that's the printing press, 1450. Restating the Bible in vernacular, in German, so that everybody can read it. If everybody can read the Bible, there's no reason to have a priest, if you're a Protestant here. And then the Catholic or the Counter-Reformation. The big thing there is the Council of Trent. In the Council of Trent, the Roman Catholic Church and Pope Paul III fixes a lot of these abuses, and it stops the bleeding. It does not bring these two religions back together, but it does stop the bleeding that is going on between the two. There's 1,000 other things you could put here. I would usually just write the Jesuits. The Jesuits are the most famous of the Catholic groups created at this time by Ignatius Loyola. You also have Marici in the Ursuline Order of Nuns and a group of other things. In the middle, in 1555, I would have Augsburg. That is a good date to know. And if you remember either Augsburg or Westphalia, you're good because they are 100 years apart. Okay, you could even put Westphalia right here because at the end of the 30 Years' War. Because ultimately, what happens is we create these two religions. Augsburg makes it legal in the Holy Roman Empire. Because these two religions are equal, they make sides, right? The Protestant Union and the Catholic League. About 50 years later, they go to war for 30 years. Last big religious war in Europe, and then Westphalia stops it all. Okay? And then finally, the big rulers to know is that, just say, mid-1500s to 1600, we have both Henry VIII, and Elizabeth. I don't know whether to put them in Reformation or put them in Renaissance or put them in absolutism, but I think the biggest problem, that when you see Elizabeth on the test, it's usually about how does she solve the Reformation problem, and what she does is settle everything down. All right, the next one is exploration. Exploration's going on, if you say somewhere in the 1400s, all the way, I usually put it till the 1600s. Okay? All the way to the 1600s. That's exploration. The most important early exploration point is Henry the Navigator of Portugal. Okay? Henry the Navigator of Portugal, and I usually put two things under him that he helps do, and that's technology. Some of the technology is the caravel, the map and compass. What else is there? Astrolabe, right? Good. Oh, that's great. And then finally, what's the reason for early exploration? What's the 3 G's? God, glory, gold, something like that. That's fine. If you remember that, I don't remember teaching that. I don't remember hearing it from probably the opening of Pocahontas, but same difference. Okay, other big points for exploration, because it's actually a pretty big in the key concepts. The Atlantic becomes the center of trade. The center of trade moves from Asia and the Indian Ocean, then it goes to the Mediterranean with the dominance of Italy, but then finally it ends up in the Atlantic. Okay, the center of trade, you could argue, since 1980 has shifted where? You could argue it shifted to the Pacific because of Asia and America, but the center of trade shifts right here to the Atlantic. The Columbian Exchange, the exchange of goods between two places. The easiest ones to remember from South America, we get potatoes and llamas. And what do we send to South America? Disease and slavery. I think slaves are such a huge part right here of the economy and society. Finally, what does exploration really do? How do we connect it? I think rivalry is the biggest point, because rivalry, competition, just like imperialism, will help lead to war. You know, we talked about Portugal coming first, then Spain, then the Dutch, then France and England. And then they all just compete with one another. Mercantilism you can put on here. I know that's a lot, but that's what today is. And then here's a big one that I think connects. New elites. Because of exploration, we have these new elites. Many are merchants, some are bankers, but we have this new section of elites that arise that's going to challenge the status quo. Then absolutism. I think we can put this right afterwards. Absolutism. If you remember the Louis XIV rules, mid-1600s to 1615. So if you do early 1600s into Louis XIV rules till 1715. I don't know if I just said that right, but that is correct. Louis XIV rules until 715. That's when he dies. Okay. You only need to know two people because you'll recognize the rest, and that's Louis XIV, Louis XIV of France, and Peter the Great. Peter the Great of Russia are the two biggest. They're the only two actually key concepts. Now, characteristics of absolutism at this time. Number one is the centralization. Centralization. If you remember the word centralization, you will remember the pyramid. Okay? They build bureaucracy, they build government so that everything comes through them. Everything comes through the Sun King. You can put under that the army, which again is another modern point. Now it is centralized, it is ruled by the states. We have these national armies that you need a national government for. They are permanent, they are professional, and they are expensive. The only other point is divine right. You would hopefully remember Sun King on your own, all this junk, but divine right always seems to be the most tested. Now, within absolutism, the opposite of absolutism is what? Constitutionalism. We are in the early stages of the Enlightenment. Maybe there's some overlap here, but it's constitutionalism. Okay? And that's when we talked about the English Civil War and the resulting what? Glorious revolution, right? When England was tempted by absolutism, but England has a powerful enough ruling class and a powerful enough voting body that they can stand up to absolutism and say, absolutely no. Next up is the agricultural revolution. Sorry. Agricultural revolution, I tack right on the end of the exploration right here. An agricultural revolution will go from the 1600s to the 1700s. And right here, it gets, we don't really know when it ends. And the next one takes over. I usually say the late 1700s, but what's the next one anyway? Industrial Rev. That'll be on our next timeline, but agricultural rev and industrial rev are really should be right next to each other. Okay? So the agricultural rev, we moved, the old type of farming is called subsistence. Right? That's when you grow food for your own family to eat and live. What's the new type of farming? Commercial. That is what most of this.
No, I'm just
okay. That is what most of these changes about. If you remember that we moved to commercial, what's the biggest thing that pushes us towards commercial? Enclosure. Enclosure is what allows the rich, right, to gather up all the land. When the rich gather up all the land, when the elites, how does that affect the regular people? That's our point. By the way, the connection between exploration and agricultural revolution is right here. How do the rich get enough money to buy all the land? Because of exploration, because of Spain going to Bolivia, we have a lot of extra gold in the money supply, and we have this price revolution, this time of inflation, and all this money goes to the elites.
That's some good hair you got.
I know what I'm doing. All right.
Looks like mine this morning.
Some of us look gorgeous naturally. Get out of here. All right. With the enclosure and the elites now ruling, we move on to that big word, proletarianization. Proletarianization, the industrious revolution. We've used 1,000 ways to say it, but farmers go, our lower class goes from peasant farmers in the countryside to landless, wandering the countryside, trying to figure out life. And most importantly, they are now working for wages. There's 1,000 ways this affects. I don't have enough time to put it all up here, so I'll just tell you. Urbanization, and that comes with problems. The problems can be crime, can be sanitation, all that other junk. All those problems start to pop up. We will solve them when we get to the industrial rev. We will solve them when we get to the government expansion, right? Public health, public education, all of that is coming. So urbanization problems. We also have the market and the putting out system, right? No longer are they making food. Instead, they're making goods to sell for money. And then finally, ultimately, we're leading to the commercial revolution. Okay? So, finally, this is one we did not focus on much in class, but the communal life. Still kind of religious based, but we're trying to celebrate more, I guess. So we have the carnival, we have Saints' Day festivals. The biggest thing that happens to the population at this time is the infant mortality rate drops. The infant mortality rate drops, which means that the population rises. We have more people. That's when our population of the world starts to go like that. And then finally, quality of life rises quite significantly. Next up is our most important era, which is Age of Reason. The Age of Reason. Let's put it all the way back to the 1500s, and let's move all the way into, I'm going to end it right here. When do we argue that the Enlightenment ends? French Rev. Okay? The culmination of the Enlightenment is the French Revolution. Now, the early part of the Age of Reason, I usually draw the dividing line around 1600. It might be a little later, but it doesn't matter. They overlap. The first part of the Age of Reason is the scientific revolution. What's the most important thing to come from the scientific revolution? The scientific method. The scientific method. All right? Now, there's two types of ways that we apply the scientific method. The most famous is in astronomy. Right? That gives us the heliocentric, which is probably the biggest challenge to the church. And a dozen other things. Right? Who are the greatest scientists of the era? Galileo, Newton, of course, Copernicus a little earlier on, but we know all of them. And then the other area where it applies is physicians. Okay? The human body, making it a complete and understandable system. The two most famous, or at least the guy you need to know is Harvey. The Graybach guy is Vesalius. I don't know how to spell it, who cares? Okay. And one point that I want to connect, right here. Just like the Renaissance, which is going on at nearly the same time, much of these people, like Kepler, like Tycho Brahe, like Tycho Brahe, they are supported by local princes and kings, much like the artists. Now the Enlightenment. Right? This is where we apply, this is where we move. Actually, here's this. What's our theme of the Age of Reason? It's we are moving from, write this down because if you have an essay about this, here's your thesis. We are moving from faith to reason. So, in the Enlightenment, we are applying reason to what? Not to science, not to stars, not to the natural world. We are applying it to politics and society. Okay? So we have two types of Enlightenment thinkers if we need to judge them, or at least two parts of the Enlightenment. One is the government, politics, that's Montesquieu, that's John Locke, natural rights. Okay? The other part, the one that most famous group that looks at society is the philosophes. The philosophes of France. Okay? Now, not only are these people writing about it, but people are reading and talking about it. Where? Salons, coffee houses, libraries, the academies. There's a dozen other things they list in the key concepts. They're all like salons. They're just salons with different words. Okay? And then our final era for this is the French Rev, right here. Now I will go very briefly in this because you know it. What are the causes of the French Rev? Well, what are the long-term causes of the French Rev? You can write these down or listen. What's the long-term cause of the French Rev? 3 estates, society and politics detached like that. What are the short-term causes? After Louis the 14th dies, France starts to go downhill. What's the best symbol that France is going downhill? 7 years more they lose, which puts them into debt. Right? Just like Great Britain went into debt and did what? Taxed America heavily in the 60s and 70s, then America revolts. France goes into debt. Then, right before the war, they have a bad harvest which results in famine. The 3 phases of the French Rev. First off is the liberal phase. The liberal phase, you know everything about this if you know the documents. Declaration of the Rights of Man. Constitution of 1791. What else is there? I know those two, honestly. You recognize the other documents. But that's not enough. We enter the radical phase. The king's head is chopped off, which is crazy because he's a divinely appointed king. Right? And the radical phase is the one that annoys the rest of Europe and will really drive the downfall. The number one thing in the radical phase is the reign of terror. Okay? The phase that follows is Napoleon. We know a lot about Napoleon. He has more key concepts written about him. Now that I've done all this, I know. He has more key concepts written about him individually than any other man in European history. Not Louis XIV, not Hitler, Napoleon. Okay? And at the end of all of this, our ending point for this timeline is what? The Congress of Vienna. That'll be on my next timeline. Guys, go back to your first timeline. What did I have as a cluster? I forget what I wrote down. Secularism, humanism, those go together. And then I had changing the status quo, as we saw a couple dozen times. All right, next timeline, I will not get finished. I'll go as late as I can, and then I'll stop. I will try to finish this at the very least in the afternoon when I do this section, which means when you get home tonight, watch the last 10, 15 minutes of this video. Shut up. First up is industrialization. Let's put industrialization starting somewhere in the 1700s. What comes right before it? Agricultural rev. Then we jump immediately into industrialization. Most of the things we draw early on are going to end around World War I. Maybe it ends a little earlier, but that is a great time period. Okay? The agricultural revolution, the number one thing to arise from this, besides the fact that people aren't farming anymore, now they can work regular jobs for wages, is urbanization. I told you there were a bunch of problems with urbanization, crime, overpopulation, all that junk. In the Industrial Rev, they start to fix it by government expansion. Government expansion in the cities, okay? The government starts to take care of some important things. They build up the infrastructure, right? That's building up government services in the cities, and they do it in a couple ways. Number one is public health, right? They start to build sewers, they start to build clean water, they start to build tenement housing. Another one is education. Public education, if we educate all, our society gets better and it gets safer, right? You're less likely to be in jail if you are, if you have a high school diploma. I'll be in here until 7:10. His sub-plans are right on his desk. You're right. You can stay here if you want. Yeah, sure. Or you can go down to the social studies office. For science in this era, there's three main eras. Number one is medicine. That's Pasteur's germ theory, that's Lister's antiseptic, right? Medicine, Darwin, looking at reality, looking at reason, and then finally, I put him in science as Karl Marx, right? I'm not just making up hippie socialist stuff. What I want is let's look at it scientific. Other part of the industrial, why did I put a G? The Industrial Revolution. First off,
You've been doing that all day.
all right, good. First, all day, the half an hour that you've been awake,
Yeah.
all right, good. In British, like, what was the British Industrial Rev like? It was like banks. All right, right this, private, which means individual investors, individual people building companies, all right? Eventually, it moves to the rest of Europe. Where does it move to the rest of Europe? 1851, the Great Exhibition. Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations in Hyde Park, England. It moves to the rest of Europe. What's the difference when the rest of Europe industrializes? Government-led. Subsidies. What's the number one thing the government builds? Railroads. If you build the railroads, if you build transportation, then other people will follow. I also want to mention in Eastern Europe, how does the Industrial Rev go? Bad. They don't have resources, they don't have transportation, they don't have strong government or willing government to help. I guess my other point I should have mentioned earlier is, why does Britain help lead the Industrial Revolution? What does it have that other countries don't? Oh, let me make sure my list is right. Yeah, money, but resources, iron and coal, they move from textiles to iron and steel to building railroads. Also, Parliament, the ruling body in Britain, actually encourages it because it's ruled by the elites who own and interact it. Right? Above the Industrial Rev, let's say in the 1800s, all the way up to World War I, is going to be imperialism. Imperialism, IMP, we're good. All right? There's actually not many key concepts here, and I think you'd understand it. The number one reason for imperialism is what? Trade. Right? We want to trade the goods we're making in the Industrial Rev. All right? Also because of nationalism. We are getting into the era. Oh, that's our cluster right here are two things for this second timeline. Nationalism, number one. Nationalism and class struggle. Nationalism between countries leads to competition between countries, which leads to World War I. One of the causes. So know that we do it for trade and a couple other reasons, but another point is actually the non-West response. How do non-Western countries react? And what are some examples of non-Western responses? Sepoy Rebellion, Boxer Rebellion, Meiji Restoration, right? Some respond with violence, some respond with diplomacy, some respond with their own modernization. Going on at the same time, in the 1800s, is that two things, that conservative versus liberal debate, and nationalism. Which is, you can also say unification. In this case, the most important point in this conservative-liberal debate is the Congress of Vienna, led by Metternich. It wants to put a traditional conservatives back in power. It's our last gasp for traditional conservatives. Nobles, kings, divine right? Nobles ruling because of legal reasons, not just because they have money, okay? Led by Metternich in Austria. They create the Congress system, or the Concert of Europe, where they, the conservative rulers, gather together to try and crush the rest of Europe. They put the Bourbons back in charge in France and all this other junk. The liberal side is led in this era. If you had to pick one thing, what would you pick? Marx and socialism. There's Saint-Simon, there's Fourier, there's a bunch of other socialists that we talked about. And this is all focused on what new part of society that comes up in the agricultural rev and the industrial rev? The workers. The working class. What do you say, Drew? Proletariat is the same thing. Now, for nationalism, it's basically nationalism or unification, right? Once 1848 comes and all the old conservative goes away, we bring in kind of this new modern conservative. Most famous, Bismarck. Second most famous, Cavour. Right? Both of them use what? Realpolitik. Which is virtue, which is humanism. Why are they using realpolitik? Because we just lived through the age of reason. Stop saying I'm in charge because God says so, and start offering deals and diplomacy and war. Because ultimately that's what drives people together. A downside of all this nationalism, specifically in what region of Europe? The Balkans. Which is going to lead to the Balkans splitting apart, which is going to lead to the First and Second Balkan War right here, which is going to lead to World War I. All right. Then we have World War I. Guys, there's like two things you need to know in World War I. Why does World War I start? Maine? Know what all those are? Why does, what happens at the end of World War I? Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles, more than any other document in AP European history, has the most key concepts written about it. There's like 5 or 6. Go back and study it. All right? What? 14 to 18. What were the main points of the Treaty of Versailles? The self-determination, right? And punish Germany. Reparations, war guilt clause, all that junk. Right? The end of World War I leads us to that area after World War I. We call it the Age of Anxiety. The Age of Anxiety. People are suffering from World War I. The Great Depression. The Weimar Republic's failure and hyperinflation in Germany. Life sucks. Right? Which is why we see somebody like Freud. Freud come up, starts looking at how the mind works. We do see some bonuses. We see science. This is, what kind of science is right here, guys?
Big science.
No, that's after, that's the Cold War because the governments are involved. This is the science kind of uncertainty. That maybe everything review isn't true. Max Planck, Heisenberg, the uncertainty principle, right? This is Einstein's theory of relativity. Okay? Like, maybe there's something behind it. Like, we're not really seeing everything. That's the weird science. Okay? The next science era will be after World War II, big science, when the governments are funding it, especially military science. Okay? And then the last thing that kind of goes into World War II is communication technology. Okay? Next up, let's do Russian Rev because I think it's pretty key. Real quick, and these are just the key concepts. This stuff is new at this point. I'm trying to get finished on, now we'll be close. Russian Rev. So this is World War I right here. The Russian Rev, we can first talk about it. All that Alexanders and Nicholases, they're nice, and maybe they have a question on it, but they're not key concepts. So they didn't care. So if we look at the end of World War, how did World War I go for Russia? Shut up. How did World War I go for Russia? Sucky. Sucky is the correct answer. Because of World War I suffering and the fact that Russia has always been backwards, they've always been a feudal, crappy society, we finally go towards revolution. The two revolutions are the February Revolution, when some kind of liberals take over, but what's the big one? The November or the October Revolution, which is far more radical and liberal. I always say November because we all know what? Red November, right? Don't worry about it. This is after World War I. It's 1917 to 1922. So if you just said after World War I, you'd be right. Now, who are the two groups that take over? Lenin, Radical Lenin, and what's his party? They're both key concepts, white box terms. Bolsheviks. Now, after they win Russia, what do the Bolsheviks immediately do? Split into a civil war and fight for a long time. So Russia just keeps sucking. But in the end, during the age of anxiety, we see the rise of Joseph Stalin. Along with the rise of Hitler, which I'll write right above it, we see the rise of Joseph Stalin. Stalin has a couple white boxes about him, but here's the two you need to know. How does he control his people? Purges. We know that. Both good and bad, right? Gives him very strong control, but the downside of the purges is he's going to murder everybody who's important to the coming war. But what does he do for the economy? How does he do it? 5-year plans. 5-year plans. What does he do for agriculture within these 5-year plans? That's the collectivization. Is that good or bad? Sucky leads to the Ukrainian famine, right? What does he do for every industry? He builds big factories and it actually works. It's the one thing that Russia really does right. And then finally, let's cover the Cold War in this same era. Because that's ultimately what Russia's about here, right? We have the Comecon versus the Marshall Plan. That's not really Russia, but that's a good Cold War point, right? America's going to help build up non-communist countries, and then we're going to do containment, where we try to hold back Russia. You can also put in some world assistance groups like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank. Both of those are designed to help, quote, third world countries from turning to communism. But there's two areas of the world we should look at, especially as we go through the Cold War. First up is the Eastern Bloc. How's the Eastern Bloc's life? Kind of crappy. And finally, what are the other areas of the world that the Cold War spills over into? Vietnam, Korea, Cuba, right? China. You can put, all of these are white box terms or gray boxes, but significant nonetheless. Guys, I have two more areas to talk about. I'm going to go a couple minutes past 7:10, but let's see if I can do it. Good job. I'm proud of you. All right. So, hey. We had World War I. We had the Age of Anxiety. Now we have World War II. There's only a couple things to know from World War II. Number one, more important than the war itself is the rise of dictators. One thing that helps the dictators come to power is technology, is communication. Say that. communication tech. What kind of communication technology comes in the 20s and 30s? Radio becomes popular and big. Adolf Hitler can reach into the homes of every person. What's the most famous president for us doing that? Fireside chats, right? Same concept. All right. The other thing is television starts to become bigger. Does every house have a TV? No. But where do you see the images? Those newsreels before motion pictures, stuff like that. So that the images start to play a powerful factor in helping Adolf Hitler and other dictators rise to power. They also use racism. Racism is kind of like the ultimate nationalism, right? Not only is our country great, but our very biological race is great. And then finally, why are they able to come to power, especially Adolf Hitler? Because the Treaty of Versailles sucked so much. The Treaty of Versailles led to what ignorant policy by the Allies before the war? Appeasement. And it also led to what? Not so great policy by America before the war. Isolation. Isolation. Okay. Our last section. Let's call it modern Europe.
What year was the World War
40, say 40 to 45. It's really 39 to 42. 40 to 45 is fine. Modern Europe. Now, guys, I am cutting out more key concepts from this than I am from the other ones because we've studied it most recently. So please, if you don't recognize all this, please go back and study it. At least read the key concept packets for like 29, 30, and 31, or at least 31. First off, after the war, because of the destruction of World War II was so bad, even worse than World War I, social welfare rose for about 20 or 30 years. And then in the 70s and 80s, social welfare will fall again because of neoliberalism. Right? We know Thatcher, we know Reagan, we know the whole 9 yards right there. I would definitely know the pill. If you get a question about women after World War II, I don't care if it's about 2016, you will try to fit the pill in your essay because it's the biggest key concept for women then. Collapse. The collapse of the USSR. USSR drops. So what does that lead to? As the USSR collapses, what happens? We see nationalism develop new countries. Some of these new countries develop peacefully. Some of these new countries develop violently, right? A lot of them are in the Eastern Bloc, but there are others around. The Balkans get screwed up again, right? Yugoslavia is going to collapse and create a dozen new countries. We also have these minor, let's call them minor nationalism movements. You know what I'm talking about? Or radical nationalism movements. That might be better. What's the best example of radical nationalists? What? The IRA. We also talked about the, what's the name of the ones in the Basque region of Spain? Yeah, that's the region.
I was just Basque.
Started with C. Basques.
Is it the Basques?
I think it's just Basques. At least that's what you say.
I don't trust you, Brandenburg. All right. The last 2 points I have is what I told you your essay is going to be about. I've told every class that. I've been wrong every year, but how is Europe becoming more of a country? We talked about the common market. Common market, what was it, the OEEC? Talk about those two things. When we get to the 80s and 90s, we see the Maastricht Treaty, which gives us the Euro and the EU. Memorize all of this, rewatch this tonight. Good luck, guys.